Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving deep into something pretty interesting. Canada's directive urging temporary residents to leave when their visas expire. We're going to be breaking down a recent YouTube video from Canada Immigration and try to figure out what this means. And get this, by the end of 2025, over 766,000 study permits alone are set to expire. So what does that mean for those individuals, for Canada's economy, and for the future of its immigration system?
Oh, it's a critical moment for sure. You see, Canada's temporary immigration system, while vital to the country, is built on this understanding that these residents will eventually leave. But this influx of temporary residents, primarily international students and workers, they contribute significantly, I think billions of dollars annually to Canada's GDP.
Wow, that's a lot. It really is like a silent engine powering so much of Canada, not just the economy, but the culture too. But if we're talking about hundreds of thousands leaving, what does that mean for all the industries that rely on them?
Well, that's a key question, and it really highlights the tension within Canada's immigration levels plan. It's this comprehensive system that dictates how many immigrants Canada aims to welcome each year across all these different categories. And it's a balancing act for the government trying to balance economic needs with the social impacts, which is where managing temporary residence gets really tricky.
So it's not as simple as just letting people in, right? It's about managing that flow, ensuring people leave when they are supposed to, and then trying to anticipate those economic ripples of their departure.
Exactly. And you have to remember there are various types of temporary visas. Some are tied to specific durations, others are extendable, and some even offer pathways to permanent residency. The government, through agencies like CBSA, they need to track all of this, ensure compliance, and then manage all those who are seeking to transition to different statuses.
Wow, I can already imagine what a logistical headache this must be for them. Hundreds of thousands of visas expiring. It's got to be a massive data management challenge, right?
Absolutely. It really requires incredibly sophisticated tracking systems and coordination between all sorts of different government agencies. A very complex system. And that sheer volume just adds another layer of complexity for sure.
And we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet here, are we? We're talking about people's lives, their hopes, their futures. They come to Canada, contribute, build lives, but there's always this uncertainty hanging over them.
You've hit on a crucial point. The human element has to be central to this whole discussion. And many temporary residents, particularly international students, they come with the aspiration of staying permanently, but that path isn't always clear or attainable.
Okay, so let's dive a bit deeper into this pathway issue. What are the actual chances of transitioning from a temporary visa to permanent residency? What does that process even look like?
Well, it can be quite complex. And to be honest, the odds aren't always in their favor. There are specific programs like Express Entry, which is a points-based system, and then provincial nominee programs, which allow provinces to nominate individuals for permanent residency based on their own specific needs.
So it's not as simple as just deciding to stay. There are all of these hoops to jump through criteria to meet. And I imagine a whole lot of competition.
Exactly. And even if someone meets all the criteria, there's still a quota system in place. The government sets limits on how many people they'll accept through each program annually.
So even if someone is highly skilled and contributing significantly, there's no guarantee they'll be able to stay.
That's the difficult reality of the system. And that's why there's this growing debate about whether Canada is relying too heavily on temporary residents without providing enough pathways to permanent residency.
So the critics are saying it's kind of like a bait and switch, right? Attract all this talent, benefit from all their contributions, and then make it really tough for them to stay permanently.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And there are legitimate concerns about potential exploitation, too. You have cases of international students, for example, working in really precarious conditions or facing wage theft. And it's because their visa status makes them more vulnerable to that kind of thing.
And then you have the housing crisis, too. I've seen a lot of reports lately about how this influx of temporary residents, particularly international students, it's really putting pressure on an already strained housing market.
Absolutely. Especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where housing is already incredibly expensive. The competition for rental units has gotten so intense, it's pushing prices even higher.
So it's this complex web of economic benefits, intertwined with all these social and ethical challenges.
Yeah, and that's what makes this directive from the Canadian government so significant. It's a stark reminder of that inherent tension within the system.
Right. The government is urging temporary residents to leave. But they also have to acknowledge how vital these individuals are to the Canadian economy and society.
And that brings us to the central question. How does Canada move forward? Can they keep relying on this influx of temporary residents without addressing these concerns? about pathways to permanency, potential exploitation, and the strain on essential services like housing.
Okay, so we've laid out the challenges, but what about potential solutions? We've talked about pathways to permanent residency. What are the specific arguments being made, and what are the potential implications of those arguments?
Okay, let's dive into that. One of the key arguments by advocates for reform is that the current system creates a precarious underclass.
When you say precarious underclass, are you referring to the temporary residents who contribute to Canada but lack the stability and rights that come with permanent residency?
Exactly. And they argue that this reliance on temporary workers, especially in sectors like agriculture and caregiving, it creates a system where these individuals are much more susceptible to exploitation. And they have very limited access to social safety nets.
And they're saying that that's fundamentally at odds with Canada's values of fairness and equality?
That's exactly the crux of their argument. They believe that if Canada's going to continue to rely on temporary workers, then they need to provide them with a much clearer path to permanent residency and ensure that their rights are protected.
So what are the potential solutions being proposed? We talked about express entry and provincial nominee programs earlier. Are there calls for changes to those programs, or are there entirely new pathways being suggested?
Well, there were multiple proposals being put forward. Some advocate for expanding existing programs like express entry, increasing the number of points you get for Canadian work experience or language proficiency, making it easier for temporary residents to qualify.
So basically tweaking the existing system to make it more accessible to those who've already proven their commitment to Canada.
Exactly. Others are calling for the creation of entirely new pathways, specifically tailored to temporary residents who have worked in certain sectors or have demonstrated a long-term commitment to the country.
It seems like a lot of this boils down to a pretty fundamental question. What does it really mean to be Canadian? Is it simply about holding a specific piece of paper? Or is it about something more like contributing to society, building a life, and putting down roots?
It's a really deep question that Canada is grappling with as it tries to navigate this complex landscape of immigration.
And it's a question that we as engaged citizens should be grappling with as well.
Absolutely. The future of Canada's immigration system and the very fabric of Canadian society. It hinges on finding answers that are both pragmatic and compassionate.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored the mechanics of Canada's temporary immigration system, the challenges it faces, and the ethical dilemmas it raises. But what does this all mean for the average Canadian? Are there any tangible impacts that we should be aware of?
Oh yeah, for sure. One of the key areas where we see a direct impact is the housing market. Like we mentioned, the influx of temporary residents, especially in major cities, it's really intensified competition for rental units.
So it's not just this theoretical debate about numbers and policies. It's something that people are feeling in their everyday lives, right?
Yeah.
When they're trying to find an apartment, or they're seeing rent prices just keep going up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about affordability either. Some argue that this reliance on temporary residents without a clear path to permanency, it kind of contributes to this sense of transience in communities.
Oh, that's an interesting point. So instead of people putting down roots and getting involved in their neighborhoods, they might be more likely to just move on when their visa expires, leading to maybe less community cohesion.
Yeah, that's the concern that's being raised. Of course, it's not a simple equation. There are a lot of factors at play, but it's definitely a perspective worth considering as we think about the long-term impacts of these policies.
So it sounds like Canada's facing a real dilemma here. On the one hand, temporary residents are absolutely crucial to the economy, filling labor gaps, contributing to growth. But on the other hand, this reliance is creating these social challenges and raising these ethical questions about how we treat people who come to Canada and contribute so much.
It really is this delicate balancing act. And this is where the government's response comes in. You see, they're trying to address these concerns while also maintaining a system that meets Canada's economic needs.
So what are they actually doing? What concrete steps are being taken to address these challenges?
Well, one of the key initiatives is this proposed reform of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It's a major piece of legislation that basically governs Canada's entire immigration system.
So we're talking about potentially significant changes to the framework that determines who gets to come to Canada and under what circumstance.
Exactly. And the proposed amendments are aiming to address some of the concerns that we've been talking about. For example, there are provisions to streamline the processing of applications, potentially reducing wait times for temporary residents who are seeking permanent residency.
So making the system more efficient and less bureaucratic seems like a good first step.
It's definitely a positive development. But the real game changer here could be the introduction of these new pathways to permanent residency, specifically for temporary residents.
So this is where the rubber meets the road. Instead of just tweaking the existing system, they're creating entirely new avenues for those who are already here and contributing.
Exactly. And the focus seems to be on sectors where labor shortages are most acute. So, for example, there might be a new pathway created for temporary foreign workers in agriculture, or for international students who graduate from Canadian universities in fields where there's high demand.
So target those areas where Canada really needs skilled workers and where temporary residents are already filling the gap. But are these new pathways like a guaranteed ticket to permanent residency? Or are there still going to be hurdles to overcome?
Well, it's important to note that these proposals are still in the early stages, and the details are being worked out. But the intention seems to be to make the process more accessible and transparent for those who meet the criteria.
So it's not just a free-for-all, but it's definitely a step towards recognizing the contributions of temporary residents and providing a more realistic path to permanency for those who want to build a life in Canada.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that these proposed reforms aren't without their critics. Some argue that they don't go far enough, that they still leave too many temporary residents in limbo.
So there are concerns that these changes might be more cosmetic than substantial.
Yeah, that's the argument being made by some advocacy groups. They believe that the government needs to be bolder in its approach and offer a more comprehensive path to permanency for all temporary residents who meet some basic criteria.
So a more universal approach rather than a targeted one.
Exactly. They argue that this would create a more just and equitable system, ensuring that everyone who contributes to Canada has a fair chance to stay permanently.
But wouldn't that lead to a massive influx of new permanent residents, potentially overwhelming the system?
Well, that's a concern that's raised by opponents of this approach. They argue that it could strain social services, exacerbate the housing crisis, and even lead to a backlash against immigration.
So it's back to that balancing act again. Trying to find that sweet spot where Canada can attract and retain the talent it needs without putting too much pressure on its resources and social fabric.
That's the challenge. And it's a challenge that's playing out in legislatures, in courtrooms, and in communities all across the country. It's a conversation that we as Canadians need to be a part of.
Well said. And it's a conversation that our listeners are uniquely positioned to participate in. Because understanding the complexities of this issue, the competing perspectives, and the potential solutions, that's the first step towards informed action.
Absolutely. Whether it's engaging in respectful dialogue with friends and family, or contacting your elected officials, or supporting organizations that are working on these issues, there are so many ways to make your voice heard.
So it's not just about absorbing information, it's about using that knowledge to shape the future of Canada's immigration system, and by extension, the future of Canada itself.
That's a powerful way to put it, because ultimately this is about more than just policies and procedures. It's about people's lives, their dreams, their aspirations. And it's about creating a society that is truly welcoming and inclusive.
I think that's a perfect segue into our final takeaway for this deep dive. But before we get there, let's just take a moment to recap the key points we've covered in this second part.
Okay, so we explored the tangible impacts of Canada's reliance on temporary residents, particularly in areas like the housing market and community cohesion. We delved into the government's response, focusing on these proposed reforms to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act.
And we examined those competing perspectives on these reforms, highlighting the arguments for a more universal pathway to permanency versus a more targeted approach. And of course, we emphasized the importance of informed action, encouraging our listeners to engage in this crucial conversation in meaningful ways. So after this deep dive into Canada's directive and the bigger picture of immigration, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? Like, what's the one thing you really want them to walk away with?
It's this. Canada's immigration system, it's changing. The reliance on temporary residents, it's created these economic benefits.
Yeah.
But it's also led to challenges that we really need to address. The government is definitely trying to find a balance. But the future really depends on finding those solutions that work practically, but are also compassionate.
So this isn't just a theoretical debate happening in some office in Ottawa, right? It has real consequences for communities, for individuals, for the makeup of Canadian society. But let's bring it back to you, our listener. What can you actually do with this information?
Well, that's where informed action comes in. First, just recognize that your voice matters. Stay informed about the proposed changes to the immigration system. Talk about it with others, even those who might have a different point of view.
Yeah, don't just sit back and absorb the information. Use it, form your own opinions, get involved in your community, maybe even reach out to your elected officials.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe think about supporting organizations that are working on these issues directly, whether they're advocating for the rights of migrant workers or helping newcomers integrate into Canadian society. Those organizations are so important in shaping a more inclusive and equitable future.
It really feels like this whole deep dive has shown us that immigration isn't just about numbers and policies, it's about people. And their lives are really impacted by the choices that we make as a society.
Absolutely, and those choices have ripple effects, not just for newcomers, but for what it truly means to be Canadian.
Let me ask you this. If you had to sum up the future of Canada's immigration system in just one sentence, what would it be?
That's a tough one. I guess I'd say the future of Canada's immigration system hinges on its ability to balance economic needs with the values of fairness, inclusivity, and compassion that really define the nation.
Wow, well said. I think that's a really powerful note to end on. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about for sure. But even more importantly, it's given us a way to understand the complexities of this issue and the tools to get involved in meaningful ways.
And as this conversation keeps going, remember to stay informed, engage in dialogue, and take action. Those are crucial steps in creating a future where Canada's immigration system really reflects its values.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope this has given you valuable insights and a renewed sense of purpose as we navigate this ever-changing world together. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.